And everywhere he looked, there were countless eyes, blazing, yellow eyes, all leveled balefully at him, the elderly resident said. His voice froze in his throat, and he sat motionless, unable to move. As the Englishman gazed fixed, he suddenly felt a sharp tugging on his jacket sleeve, and slowly glanced down. It was in the summer of 1964 when I first heard the story of the silent audience. I was a youth of about 17, and the teller was an incredibly old man who sat on a rickety porch spitting tobacco juice at a rusty coffee can. Never once did I see him hit his target, but that didn't seem to faze him one bit. It happened in the old mining town of Boulderville, 16 miles east of Hogan's Gap, west of Weaverton, tucked away in the Nye Alps. In the spring of 1922, an Englishman by the name of Alex Tuttle arrived at this former boomtown turned tourist resort. He was a professor who taught at the University of Oxford, lecturing on the world's ancient legends and mythology. A prodigious writer, as well as a meticulous observer and researcher, Tuttle had published more than 30 books on a lot of topics from the religious beliefs among the Ainu to the superstitions of the Finns and the Lapps. Oftentimes his scholarly research took him to the most remote corners of the world. The stranger the location, the better. Both his office study and stately townhouse were filled to the brim with not only books and research papers, but with curious mementos, collected from his years of travelling abroad. Looking at Alex Tuttle, one would have thought he neither had the means nor the energy to go travelling from place to place. He was a small, skinny, scraggly-haired man, shabbily dressed with thick-lensed spectacles. Add to that a very pale and unhealthy pallor, and he came across looking like a starving bohemian poet, rather than a methodical investigator of antiquarian pursuits. It was business of a surprisingly different sort that brought Professor Tuttle to Boulderville. While engaged in research for a book about the mysterious Lontakas people of northern California, it had come to his knowledge that the Boulderville Library contained extensive historical information on this weird race of humanoids. Since the library had refused several written requests to loan him the documents, he had decided to set out in person to see if he could be granted access to this valuable collection. Accompanying the professor on his journey were two other Oxford men, Thomas Shelton and Ralph Adkins. Both were archaeologists and were keen on studying the strange megalithic sites recently uncovered. It was early in the morning when Professor Tuttle arrived. He had left his two friends back in their hotel at Weaverton under the promise to join him in 2 weeks' time. He had hoped to meet Sam Branson, the museum's proprietor, and Herb the Prospector, one of the ancient residents who knew a lot of old legends of the non-human indigenous people. Unfortunately for the professor, the library's entire document collection just days before had been eaten by bottle ants. Sam Branson had hanged himself, and as for old Herb, according to one resident, he went looking for gold last year and never came back. However, local gossip directed the professor to a Jordan hermit woman named Anna Crabtree. Perhaps she could tell him all that he wanted to know about these strange, ghastly folk. When he arrived at her cabin on the outskirts of town, he found it empty. Neighbors were there informed him that she went hunting and probably wouldn't be back for a fortnight. Disappointed, though slightly hopeful, he settled into an inn to await her arrival. He didn't have to wait for very long though. A few days later, when Professor Tuttle was browsing at the general store combination coffee shop, a small brown-skinned woman in buckskin strolled inside. He gawked. She looked quite out of place among the sturdy, weathered-looking locals. He tapped the shoulder of the nearest drugged gentleman. "Pardon me, sir," said the professor, pointing, "but who is that young lady over there?" "Oh, that'll be Miss Crabtree." The grizzled patron nodded over his large cup of coffee. "She's a Jordan woman, you know. Got here quite by accident, 11 years ago. Something went wrong with the two-way door between this world and hers, and it's spat her out here. Well, we're quite used to her, seeing as there are other fairy folk living around here. What's more nicer compared with them stuck-up elves with their we ain't good enough for the likes of them mere mortals attitude. Beautiful singer too, like a bird. Bit shy though. Doesn't dare to go to parties, just keeps to herself. Makes no trouble. Maybe she's waiting for that door to get fixed so she can go on home." Professor Tuttle gawked some more. He had expected a frizzy-haired, leathery-skinned, corncob, pipe-smoking harridan, not some delicate non-human girl with long white hair and amber cat's eyes. Walking up to her, he said abruptly, "Good afternoon." Miss Crabtree leapt high into the air and then wheeled around with hair bristling and claws unsheathed. Staring at him with wide saucer eyes, she hissed like a little steam engine. "Oh, did I forget to mention she starters easily?" the patron called out. Professor Tuttle hesitated a moment, but then met the Gurdon's fierce gaze unflinchingly. "Allow me to introduce myself," he continued. "My name is Professor Alex Tuttle, and I most humbly beg your pardon for intruding on your shopping. But I'm in pressing need of your assistance for research on a book I'm doing about the Lonticas. I was told you know quite a lot about these legendary creatures." Miss Crabtree's dark complexion turned as pale as gruel. "Have you suddenly gone insane?" she whispered furiously. "Or have you gone and eaten some hallucinatory mushrooms? Ask me anything about the uncanny, were-otters, aquatic pumas, fire witches, you name it, but whatever you do, don't ever ask me about those folk. They're accursed by both gods and the nations of fair folk. They're far more evil than any of the demons that inhabit this world, for they always go back on their bargains, something that even demons would never do. If I were you, I'd quit this book of yours and leave this place at once." With that, she turned around and hurried out the door. Despite his small stature and frail appearance, Professor Tuttle was highly stubborn and persistent at getting his own way. Not even the threat of death and possible damnation was enough to deter him from his latest book project. He spent the rest of the afternoon attempting to change Miss Crabtree's mind. It took him a while, 3 whole days to be exact. By the 4th day he was helping her with daily errands and chores in exchange for snippets of information, always in the form of small handwritten notes discreetly passed to him during his labour. Meanwhile, both the tourists and locals would snicker and chuckle at the sight of this ungainly gentleman being ordered around by a diminutive fairy girl. Often he had to endure the wisecracks all the while he was in the crowded store with a basket under his arm. There was even talk of wedding bells. After 10 more days of constant embarrassment and demanding work, Miss Crabtree gave him a final piece of advice. "Now that I gave you all you need to know about these folk," she said gravely, "I want you to promise me that you won't go breathing a word about this to anyone while you're here." "All right," he said, impatient to be on his way. "Damn it," Miss Crabtree cried, forgetting to whisper in her excitement. "You're not taking this seriously. Now listen to me carefully. While you're here, go about your business as though nothing had happened. Your only hope of survival lies in completely ignoring them, in order they may ignore you." "Even when I'm thinking?" exclaimed Professor Tuttle in bewilderment. "Especially when you're thinking," rasped Miss Crabtree, bristling her white mane. "Just thinking about them brings them coming. They can home in on your thoughts like sharks or crocodiles. Try your hardest to keep your mind blank as possible, or if you can't do that, try thinking about silly things, stuff that doesn't really matter much, like remembering nursery rhymes or counting crows. Above all, do not refer them by name. To even mention them by their name draws their attention." "All right," he whispered gravely, "I'll try to keep that promise." "You better well keep it," Miss Crabtree hissed, showing off her sharp feline teeth. "You wouldn't want these folk finding out you're doing a book about them without asking their permission. You heard about that museum guy and old prospector? Well, rumours have it that they were both working on a book together, something about the folk and the strange rites they do off in the hills. Those humans should have just minded their own business. The more you stick your nose into other people's business, the more likely you're going to die or disappear. We lost a lot of tourists and missionaries that way, too damn curious for their own good." Later that day, he ran into Thomas Shelton and Ralph Atkins. The archaeologists were back on the way to their hotel after exploring some nearby megalithic strictures. After talking of incidents that had happened since their last meeting together, Professor Tuttle invited the two to have lunch with him. They went to the inn where he was staying, and it wasn't long before the professor mentioned the great progress he made on his latest book. Shelton lit his pipe and regarded the professor's bundle of notes and memo pads. "So you've been studying the Lonticas legend too, eh?" he mused, leaning his tall, wiry frame back into his chair. "I knew that a few of my colleagues had tried connecting them to one of those standing stones deep in the woods, but then these were the very same people who also believed in the existence of Atlantis and Avalon." The short, portly Atkins put down his fork and wiped his handlebar moustache with a silk handkerchief. "My dear fellow," he said to Tuttle, "you've certainly done a very remarkable job in collecting all this data. However did you manage to accomplish this? It must have been rather difficult in getting the locals around here to speak of such things." "Yes, I did have a little bit of difficulty at first," said Professor Tuttle, rubbing his work-blistered fingers. "But then I met this otherworld expatriate who told me a great deal about the Lonticas. I'll tell you one of the stories she told me." And then he took the first of the pads from the pile and began reading the first few pages. March 17th, 1911. I have a neighbour, a cheerful elderly widow and former schoolteacher, who wasn't squeamish about things like cutting firewood, installing a new rain barrel, or butchering and preparing her own meat. Yet, when it came to matters concerning magic and wandering spirits, she was downright superstitious. Oftentimes she would sprinkle mustard seeds and sparkly ornaments around her yard to confuse vampires. To deter witches from entering, she had a horseshoe hanging over her door, pointed downward, and fishnet over the windows. For extra protection, she carried a rabbit's foot in her coat pocket and a piece of rattlesnake skin in one sandal. One day she visited me to see her at the cottage. I was not sure whether she had invited me to do her good neighbour duty to the newcomer, or if she really wanted to see me. I decided to go anyway, as I liked her cats and she seemed to be an alright person. I went the next Saturday but with mixed feelings, as I was very worried that I would inadvertently commit some faux pas in etiquette and be seen as a barbarian. The rustic cottage looked small from the outside, but the warm and spacious interior gave off a nice and friendly atmosphere. We sat in the kitchen sipping tea and lunching on thick pea soup and buttermilk pancakes, when then quite suddenly she got up and took from the range a pot of bubbling concoction consisting of sealing wax and several pungent, aromatic herbs. I watched curiously as the widow went about methodically sealing all the cracks in her house, including those around windows and door. "Is that to keep the rats and mice out?" I finally asked, thinking that her cats were having trouble controlling the pests already in the walls. "Oh no," she said, shaking her grey head. "No, not those kind of pests. Shokins." Shokins? I looked at her questioningly. "Are those dangerous creepy crawlies like the Botlands and Black Widows?" "Oh, shokins aren't arthropods," she replied, smiling brightly. "They're a kind of fairy type folk we got living around here. I call them shokins, although people around here just call them the folk, or the dark lurkers. It's considered very bad luck to call them by their real name." She went on to explain that her family originated in the Appalachians, and that her Cherokee grandmother would tell her tales about this mysterious race of humanoids with sharp, pointed faces, bright, cat-like eyes, and long index fingers. They were also relatives of a much shorter race called the Pineys, who lived deep in the New Jersey Pine Barrens. Legend had it that both these nocturnal folk lived in North America long before the arrival of the first humans, and that they despised the new people for driving them into dark corners of the continent. Yet even as we speak, they were plotting a return to power, taking the earth back from the arrogant human usurpers. "So, how big are these things exactly?" I inquired, scratching my head. "Mouse size?" "No, people size," the widow replied. "But they got witch-like powers and could turn themselves into a wisp of mist to pass through a crack or a keyhole." "Have you ever seen one actually do this mist trick?" I asked, somewhat skeptically. "Well, no," she said hesitantly, putting down her sealing pot and wiping her hands. "But I heard stories of people disappearing into thin air, often from locked rooms. So I'm just making sure it doesn't happen to me. No malign force is going to burst into this place. It's sealed so tight you could use it as a boat." "I reckon evil will leave this place alone on account of the herb smell," I wryly remarked, crinkling my nose. Shelton tilted his head and sucked on his pipe. "Sounds like these chaps could be related to the vampires in Europe," he said thoughtfully. "I wonder if that Jerdin girl might be related to these creatures." Atkins lit a cigar from a candle on the table. "Perhaps even a hybrid between a man and a Lontacar," he suggested, sending smoke in slow, graceful spirals up to the ceiling. "There are fey human half-breeds in different parts of the world." "There's something here that might answer that question," Professor Tuttle murmured. He continued. "When I asked the widow if she ever thought I was a Shonokin on account of my cat-like eyes and claws, she said no, because I didn't have the long pointed face and weird long index finger. Also, I didn't practice black magic, have a garden full of weird dangerous plants, or live in a house-like plant that ate lone wayfarers." Before I left her cottage, she warned me that I should not go out alone into the mountains, lest these inhuman monsters would kidnap me, that I should leave a trail of mustard seeds and shiny baubles out to distract them, otherwise they would come into my house and either grab me or steal all my stuff, and that I should hang up a handy piece of cheap blessed item that would deter these weirdos. I said I would take it into consideration and started heading back home. Since I spent a good deal of time talking to the widow, it was early evening when I got back. I soon discovered my cabin completely destroyed. A bear had wrecked most of its contents and eaten most of its food. I didn't get its paws on the few canned rations I had. I cleaned up the best I could, then had some sardines and green beans for supper. March 18th, 1911. I decided to restock my meat supply. Heeding the widow's warning about going alone in the mountains, I decided to go hunting near the deserted mining settlement of Orville, along one of those old pioneer trails. I was crossing this meadow when an unexpected storm blew up. The rain started bucketing down and I witnessed lightning hit a nearby pine tree, cleaving it nearly in half. Not wanting to get hit myself, I started looking for someplace dry and out of range of any lightning bolt. The first place I came to was a deserted, weather-beaten house and barn, sitting among some willow trees. Although it might be cozy and dry inside, I kept on walking, for I heard stories that a particularly nasty ghost of an old miser haunted that place. A few miles downhill, I came upon a tiny white church tucked against the hillside. As I neared the building, however, I noticed that it had been abandoned for some time. The steeple with its cross had long since collapsed, most of the paint was peeling off and nearly all the windows were cracked and broken. But at least the roof was still intact. Fumbling at the door, I found it unlocked and rushed inside. After setting myself near the front of the church, I started to relax. This is nice, I thought. Plenty of bone-dry space and no eldritch boogeymen are going to come get me in this sacred human place. Then, stretching myself out on the pew, I soon fell into a deep sleep. I didn't remember how long I slept exactly, but suddenly there was a blinding flash of lightning, and then thunder shook the old church to its foundation. Jolted awake, I sat up with a start. As soon as my eyes adjusted to the dismal gloom, I noticed that I was no longer alone in the church. There were people seated in nearly every pew, tall, dark-haired, beaky-nosed people. They were all staring at me with greenish-yellow eyes. Professor Tuttle paused momentarily, for he had noticed that a trio of customers was also listening. He would have ignored them had it not been for the fact that they bore a somewhat striking resemblance to the people in this story. Sharp, pointed features and glittering cat eyes. While he stared, a little white-haired gentleman strode past the three and out the door. For some strange reason, the chap acted as if there was nothing amiss. Eventually, the white hair returned and went to join the unnerving trio. He nearly cringed. The man seemed taller and paler than before, and in his long, thin face were the bright yellow eyes of a feline. "Alex?" Professor Tuttle turned his startled eyes on Shelton, who was looking at him oddly. Shelton took his pipe from his mouth. "Are you feeling all right?" he asked worriedly. "You look rather pale." Professor Tuttle slowly nodded. "I'm quite all right," he said. "I just had a rotten night, hardly slept a wink." Atkins blew a cloud of cigar smoke and looked searchingly at his pale friends. "I'm not surprised. You've been working so hard on this Lonticast that little by little these creatures are coming to life." "Balderdash!" Professor Tuttle exclaimed, already dismissing the strange experience, too much gin and scotch and too little sleep. "And to prove to you good gentlemen that it is balderdash, I'm going to continue on with my story. According to the old legends, after a Lonticus tale is told, something fearful supposes to occur. Well, let's put it to the test then, shall we?" Then he continued on with his reading. I stared across the shadowy rows in half-incredulous terror, but then, gradually, the reasonable part of my mind took control. This singular event had to be the result of my ridiculous, overactive imagination. That was my whole trouble. Too much imagination. Ever since I was a cub, I had read with relish the tales of writers like Edgar Allan Poe, Arthur Machen, or Bram Stoker. Now all the stories were stuck in my mind and not easily gotten rid of. To rid myself of this annoyance, I rubbed her eyes hard and pinched myself hard several times. The damnable things were still here. Obviously, these folk couldn't be dismissed as hallucinations or an optical effect of light and shadow. The thought that I was not losing my mind gave me somewhat momentary comfort, but it wasn't helpful. These people still bothered me with their wide knowing smiles and their baleful gleaming eyes. "This has got to be a trick," I thought, frowning stubbornly. "Someone must have heard about my gullibility and decided to give me a scare. Well, it's not going to work." "Who the devil are you?" I exclaimed hoarsely. The congregation, if you could call it that, spoke up at once, their appalling voices sounding like a blend of the cry of damned souls, howling wolves and the yelping of wild geese. "Our name is Lonticars, and we are the ones that dwell in lonely and wild places. We are old, though not as old as the making of the world. We worship the dwellers of the hidden places and the great old ones who will one day come forth from the earth and the stars. Any mortal or outcast fae caught venturing into our territory will be made into one of us, for we regard that as a more fitting revenge against trespassers than just mere death." "The hell with you all," I shouted. "I'm out of here." Then I jumped up from my pew and took off down the aisle, as she had not run since childhood. With bristling hair and sharp-toothed grins, the Luntica swarmed close behind me. I felt clawing against my back, and the numerous hands seized hold of my jacket. Then Professor Tuttle's voice fell into a faint quaver, and then died away completely. The room had suddenly become very dark and gloomy, and everywhere he looked, there were sharp-nosed figures, steadily watching with glowing eyes. He felt the tug of a hand on his sleeve of his jacket and looked down. The hand was the color of polished bone with long curved nails. The third finger was longer than the middle. Professor Tuttle turned to face Shelton. At least it was Shelton a few minutes ago. "What happened next?" the Shelton thing asked, watching him the way a dog watched a bone. "Did she escape, or didn't she?" Atkins smiled. It wasn't a very nice smile. The lips were a trifle wide and the teeth long and very sharp. His eyes shone in the waning candle and firelight, adding to his new diabolicalness. Tuttle licked his dry lips and swallowed several times. Yet, when he finally opened his mouth, all that came out was stuttering. He knew how the story ended. It was just that he was afraid of what might happen as soon as he had finished telling it.